Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
Fucking. Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
We're going to keep trying until you get it right. Hi, I'm James.
And I'm James.
I'm going to choke you. I'm going to choke you like a when I see you again. I'm going to put my hand around your neck and I'm going to squeeze the life right out of you.
Go ahead, James. Say it.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
The unemployment rate is lower today than it was pre-COVID.
That doesn't seem right.
And it's true. It's even more than that. It is the lowest right now. The unemployment rate is the lowest it has been since May of 1969, which doesn't sound right.
It's going to conflict badly with what I want to talk about in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, well, in part it doesn't sound right because of how we calculate it. The unemployment rate is not the fraction of people who are unemployed. It's the fraction of people in the workforce who are unemployed. And we only count you as being part of the workforce if you either have a job or you are actively looking for one.
So all of these people who have become discouraged don't count?
Chronically unemployed, you stop looking for a job or you take early retirement, you're not counted anymore. A different measure that we have that's perhaps more telling is called the employment population ratio. This is the fraction of working age adults who are employed. So think people ages 15 to 65 who are employed. What fraction are employed? That number's coming up, but it's low enough that it's at a level that was last seen in 1977 as we were climbing out of the supply shocks due to the oil embargo. So in this kind of strange turn of events, while our unemployment rate is historically low, it is in part because a decent number of people have just left the workforce. They're not counted anymore. And in fact, it's about 1.5 million people. We would need another 1.5 million workers to get back to where we were prior to COVID.
So when the Biden administration touts its successes in the unemployment arena, it's not exactly right. The way unemployment is measured, they're not lying.
That's right. But you have to understand the way it's measured. And what's driving those nice numbers is 1.5 million people who have been unemployed for so long, they've just given up.
And what percentage of the workforce would 1.5 million be?
Well, that's an interesting question. Anticipating it, I calculated it for you.
Hey now.
It's about 1%, which doesn't sound like much, but 1.5 million workers is a tremendous amount of potential labor. And when you're looking at an economy hopefully growing at in a real sense at 2%, 3% a year, 1% variation number of workers can have a significant impact.
You should keep your eye on that in addition to the numbers that you hear from politicians' mouths, because politicians will spin things exactly the way they want to.
That, and it annoys me to no end when politicians either cast blame or try and take credit for jobs. They say, I've created so many jobs. Politicians create zero jobs. It's entrepreneurs who create jobs. The best politicians can do is leave them alone and let the entrepreneurs do what they do. So really what the politicians should be saying is, I didn't destroy any jobs.
And here I want to take a shot at the last president because his protectionist measures destroyed jobs across the country. These 3,000 auto workers didn't get laid off. These other 9,000 workers did. And the rest of you all paid higher prices.
And here's an interesting thing, because economists disagree on a number of policy points. But of all of the various things you might think of, the one thing that economists across the board agree most on is the beneficial effects of free trade. Protectionism can benefit some people, but in total, it's a bad idea.
And I think people might be shocked to hear the other thing that most economists agree on is that a minimum wage will cost jobs.
Right. They do disagree, but their disagreement is on the magnitude of the jobs that it costs, not on whether it costs jobs.
And if you look at protectionism on the one hand, the lack of free trade, and then minimum wage on the other, you realize that they're exactly the same issue.
They are. You've just drawn the border at a different place.
I'm pulling a news story from the New Jersey, New York area about the stress that food banks are under. Things are getting rather difficult for people who are on that edge of not quite being able to afford food. And they got hit with a double whammy just recently that I don't think enough people are really talking about right now. There was an expiration in a temporary SNAP boost. So what we euphemistically call food stamps got bumped up so people could go buy more groceries. But that's expired. And people now are receiving less in the form of government benefits vis-a-vis food at the same exact moment that food prices are skyrocketing. And I finally have found a figure. I don't know how good the figure is, but this article, uncited of course, claims that we're now seeing food prices running 24% above pre-COVID levels. I don't go to grocery stores often, which may actually give me a better point of view on the matter. I didn't go to a grocery store for like a year, and then I did, and I got sticker shock walking up and down the aisles. I was insulated from seeing it, and I think it gave me a better perspective.
Yeah.
These two things working in tandem have thrown the food banks into a tizzy. We've got a real problem here, I suspect, and it's not one that's going to go away anytime soon. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the answer is almost never throw more benefits at it. That just causes the problem to amplify down the road. And yet, what do you say to people who literally can't afford food? Which brings us to the foolishness of the week. Food-related and New Jersey-related. One of the all-time great headlines from NPR, a massive dump of pasta in New Jersey sets off a fury of interest and also a fury. Out in the woods in New Jersey, somebody dumped pasta. They dumped 15 wheelbarrow loads of pasta.
Oh my God.
They dropped so much of it that it created its own pasta wall. And come to find out, when you put uncooked pasta out in the open, it starts to cook. And it becomes soft, just like the pasta you would eat. Where the hell does 15 wheelbarrow loads of pasta come from?
Yeah, and you got to hire people to help you out with that.
It seems that maybe it took more than one person to get it out there, in which case somebody's going to talk eventually.
Yeah, and why?
The best guess seems to be that somebody was perhaps hoarding pasta in a house the way people hoard all kinds of things, and then either died or had to move, and all the pasta got dumped outside. The great villain in the story apparently is the lack of bulk garbage pickup in certain places. If they had been able to just get rid of this stuff, it wouldn't have found its way out into the woods. The pictures in the article are worth the price of admission alone because it's more than one kind and they're all mixed together in this melange of pasta out in the woods. Elbows and ziti and spaghetti, you name it, it's in the pile.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumberspodcast.org.
This is a two-part episode recorded live at Brookfield Academy in Brookfield, Wisconsin. James and I spent the day lecturing to Brookfield students on topics in economics and government, then closed the day with this live Q&A session.
What is it you want to talk about? Boy, I didn't expect to get an answer that fast. Are you always like this? I mean, I see you sitting in the front row. I see the hand go up like a rocket. I figured, okay, what's your name?
I'm Owen.
Owen, have at it, man.
What do you think are some possible reforms for Social Security?
Is that all? That's all?
We've got 40 minutes. Possible reforms for Social Security.
Well, we told people how they could solve this problem.
If you think of it as an investment, which from our perspective as taxpayers, that's exactly the way we should be looking at it. You're taxed a certain amount from your paycheck when you work. When you retire, you get back benefits. That's a straight up financial arrangement, and you can do the calculations to see what is the effective rate of return on the taxes that you're paying in. And if you do the math, you find some disturbing things. For the typical American, the rate of return on Social Security is around 1%, maybe 2%. That's it. And that's the average American. If you're a male, it's a little bit lower. If you're a female, it's a little bit higher. If you're African American, it's substantially lower. If you're an African American male, it's actually negative, the rate of return on Social Security. And the reason for that is because the government, now nobody uses these words, but this is the reality. The government imposes a 100% death tax on Social Security benefits. That is, you can work up to age 64 paying into Social Security, and on the first day of your retirement, you drop dead, you don't get any benefits. Your heirs get no benefit. Now, there's a footnote there. If you have minor dependents, they'll get something until they reach age 18. If you have a spouse, depending on how much your spouse earned, your spouse might receive a portion of the benefits. But generally speaking, the benefits are lost. So people with lower life expectancies, that's males, particularly African American males, can expect to receive less benefits simply because they don't live as long. With that as background, the Social Security is a horrible investment from that perspective. It turns out it is such a bad investment that the typical American would be better off, rather than having Social Security as we have it, do the following.
This would affect you people, but not really us.
Right.
Think in your own terms.
You get your first job, you start paying into Social Security, you keep paying Social Security as you do, until you hit about age 40. At age 40, you walk away. You say, okay, government, I forfeit all Social Security benefits. When I retire, you don't have to pay me a dime. In exchange, don't tax me any further. So from age 40 forward, I'll pay income tax and all that stuff, but don't charge me the Social Security tax. Social Security is such a bad investment, you're actually better off doing that. Walking away from 25 years worth of money you've put into the thing. Because instead what happens is that 12% you combine with your employer that used to be going to the government, that now is yours. Invest it privately. And the rate of return that you'll get from private investment is so high, you'll more than make up for what you lost. So under that model, you all are better off doing this. For the first 25 years you're paying in, where's that money going that you're paying in? It's supporting people like us who are now retired, and we can't just shut off the Social Security system, right? You get this wave of people who are weaned off of the Social Security system. So over the course of a couple of generations, you're done. There's nobody on Social Security.
And people could still opt to stay in it.
That's worth talking about, because what you could do is maintain Social Security for what it was intended for, a safety net for the poorest of the poor. It was never designed for people in general.
The added benefit here is that really the first third of your life you'd be working functionally for free, right, in terms of a retirement. But the second 2/3 you'd be working for yourself. But as luck would have it, that first third of your working life you don't make that much anyway. The second 2/3 you see a real escalation in your salary. Every benefit really ends up accruing to the individual worker here, while still maintaining a system just enough that you could sunset it out of existence. In the end, we've made promises to large groups of human beings, and those promises need to be kept. Where the problem lies is finding enough time to get the job done.
Well, it's not just that, because what we talked about here is the economics of it. There's also a political side, because this is public policy. It's not just the economics that has to work, the politics have to work. And the politics do not favor finding a solution to Social Security.
And it certainly doesn't favor long-term solutions
Right.
to anything.
Exactly. So long as Social Security remains on the cusp, oh my God, it's going to go bankrupt in a few years, it's a problem. So long as it remains a problem, politicians on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, have the ability to use this in election time and say, look, Social Security, it's this problem. All of a sudden, we're going to have a bunch of retirees not having their benefits, or we're going to have to raise taxes on the workers, and all of you get concerned about that. And that's great for me, the politician, because I say, get out there and vote. Elect me and I'll solve the problem. And what you as voters typically don't realize is I don't have an incentive to solve the problem.
No.
I have an incentive to keep the system teetering on the edge so that I can use it again the next election cycle.
Right, and Joe Biden just did this a month or two ago. He said that's off the table, and congressmen and senators from both parties said harumph, right, yes, it's off the table. And yet from our perspective, just looking at the numbers, you can't take it off the table. It needs to be fixed.
It is the single biggest line item in the federal budget. You'll hear people say things like, well, the military. The military is the largest line item in the discretionary part of the budget. The budget's two pieces, discretionary and mandatory, which is just accounting business. The fact is the whole thing is the federal budget. But if you put the whole thing together, Social Security by far is the largest. And the numbers are something like, I think the Social Security budget this year is something like 1.2 trillion. The Department of Defense is, I think, 700 billion, 800 billion, yeah.
If you cut every penny of defense spending, all of it, to zero, you wouldn't balance the budget. And that gives you an idea of just how out of whack our budgets have gotten. Because people always say the same thing, well, if you need money, go cut the military. Okay, fine, let's cut it to zero. Still don't have anywhere near enough money. So.
And you notice something if you go down this path of talking about Social Security or the military, whatever it is, you quickly realize as you look at the numbers in terms of the federal government, we don't have a revenue problem. Federal government's revenues actually have been rising at about 6% a year on average.
I think it's gone up every year.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gone up every single year, but nonetheless, on average, it's about 6% a year, the federal revenues increasing, which is astounding.
That's
If
astonishing.
that was your household income going up 6% a year, it doesn't matter how poor you are. Give a couple of decades, you're going to be great.
You could start with a couple $100 and you're going to be wealthy by the time you're in your 50s,
Yeah.
right? The nature of compounding interest such that it is.
But our problem fiscally at the federal level is not revenues, it's expenses.
Spending.
Regardless of how much revenues we get, the politicians spend more than that.
Well, don't they spend $1.25 for every increase of $1?
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, because people will say things like, well, we can fix the federal budget by raising taxes, bring in more revenue.
Except you can't.
Except every time, I say every time, on average, for every additional dollar the federal government brings in, the next year, Congress spends an extra $1.20. It actually makes it worse.
So the more money you bring in, the worse it gets. And we should have an easy national life. We have all the ingredients. We're a phenomenally wealthy country.
Oh, the wealthiest country in the history of human beings.
And
Yeah.
it's not even close.
Yeah.
It's not even close. We still find a way to bungle it year in and year out.
Well, and that's interesting because talk about this problem, and people's natural reaction is to say, well, okay, how do we solve this problem? This is where the field of public choice in economics becomes very interesting, because in public choice we talk about people's behaviors as economic animals and how those behaviors play out in the voting booth, how they play out amongst politicians. And it turns out that this phenomenon we have of spending way more than we bring in is perfectly predictable, given the setup. To make it easy for you, picture an analogy. Here we are, a bunch of people in the room, and let's suppose that every day we order lunch. You can order whatever it is you want for lunch, and the bill comes in, and the bill gets divided evenly amongst everybody else. We start off, and everybody's frugal. You order a sandwich or something, and it occurs to Owen one day, I could order steak. Steak is going to cost me more than I'm willing or able to pay, but that's all right because my bill is divided up amongst all of you.
I just lived this reality all last week, right, where I was at a conference in an exotic location.
Yeah.
And everybody would go out for dinner every night.
And share the bill.
And my dinner is, look, I'm a pretty low rent kind of guy. A hamburger and a Coke and I'm good. Mm-hmm. And then people realized they could pass the wine bill off on other people.
Yep. So Owen has this incentive to order an expensive lunch because the cost of that lunch is going to be put off on the rest of you.
It'll cost you like $1 more.
Yeah, it costs him $1 more, but it costs all of you $1 more, right? But then other people start noticing, look what Owen's doing. I could do that too. I could have steak. And all of you all of a sudden are ordering, saying, none of you can afford it, right? And we all say, this is horrible. We can't afford this. We need to go back to sandwiches. Everybody nods sagely and says, yes, let's go back to sandwiches. And some of you go back to sandwiches. And as some of you go back to sandwiches, Owen says,
I could still get a steak.
I could order 2 steaks. And you see the incentives. As economic animals, because we're sharing the bill, everyone has an incentive to spend more and more.
The only way to solve it with academics at conferences is not to go out to dinner.
Well, but that's interesting because this is why we do this together. I'm an economist, he's a political scientist, because so many of these questions hit both these fields, right? So this next thing I'm going to talk about is his field. But it seems to me you can't get rid of the problem, but to mitigate it is to make your decisions, your fiscal decisions, not at a federal level where you can spread the cost over everybody, but at a state level, where you're limited in your ability to spread it across. Better yet, make it at a local level that limits you even further. And that gives the voters, the people, the ability that if you're living in a community that's doing what I described, spending way too much, you could say, that's enough, I'm leaving. You can go somewhere else. And that puts the brakes on the spending here, because all of a sudden, you say, well, we've really got to do something because otherwise everybody's going to leave.
And it's getting into this idea of consequences. We talk only about what we want. We never talk about what we can reasonably hope to afford. The idea of consequences is so divorced from desire.
Right.
You find that here in the rational adult world, you can't separate consequences and desires. They have to be taken together. And yet everything about politics separates them.
And it wasn't designed that way. If you read the Constitution, the plain words on the page, Article 1, Section 8, lists the things the federal government is permitted to do. The federal government is not permitted to do anything outside that. It's like a list of 8 things.
Not even that it has to, just that it can.
Right, not even that it has to, that it can. And I would say, just off the top of my head, 90% of what the federal government does today does not fall under Article 1, Section 8.
No, I suspect it's much worse than that even. I think it's beyond 90%. This problem was predicted by the anti-federalists, right, who said, look, we've read this new Constitution that you boys have written, and the necessary and proper clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8, and then the supremacy clause, which indicates that everything that happens at the federal level is supreme to whatever might happen at the state level. Those two things are going to work hand in glove to create all manner of problems. The anti-federalists were brilliant critics. They were able to predict what would happen with remarkable clarity. I think they generally got the problem of a standing army wrong. It was overblown. Apart from that, most of the criticisms they offered were spot on. And even the standing army criticism wasn't crazy.
What was that criticism?
That a standing army would just become abusive to the liberty of the people. I don't think that's been exactly right. It's become abusive to the liberties of other people. But boy, these other things, the problem was that they didn't offer a positive plan. They didn't say, okay, those things are terrible for the reasons we've just told you, so do this instead. There was no so do this instead. They were brilliant critics with no plan. And if you don't have a plan to offer to replace one that you just criticized, you're probably not going to get too far. We still read them today. I think Brutus is one of the finest critics of the American regime there ever was. But what did he offer? What was the positive plan? Did we know these things were going to happen? Well, some of us did, and it was reasonable to assume that. What do you do about it? Parchment barriers, as Publius referred to it in the Federalist, aren't ever going to be enough, right? Instead, you have to have ambition, counteracting ambition. You have to set up an institutional government such that it's always fighting with itself. We've got a government which, if working correctly, doesn't work well at all. It's designed to be inefficient. So every 20 years, when a businessman says, I'm going to run for president, I'm going to run government like a business. No, you're not, you idiot. That's not the design, right? It's not designed to be run like a business. The last thing you want is efficiency. Think about every efficient government there ever was. They're all terrifying. So you want what Hamilton said, a government that's very, very powerful in the few things it can do, but powerless in everything else.
And one of the interesting things here is we have, over time, mitigated the government fighting against itself.
Yeah, we've gone the other way.
Yeah, you learn this in high school about the 3 branches and the balance of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial. What we don't talk about, because through constitutional amendment we've mitigated it, there was another balance that was supposed to occur between the federal and the state. And that happened in large part by the state legislatures electing senators to the Senate. The people were never supposed to elect the senators.
This idea of direct election of senators is foolishness of the first rank when you look at the original Constitution and the way it was set up to have the Senate act as a brake that acted in the name of the states. And think of it this way, too. There were a raft of Supreme Court decisions that were decided knowing that. And then in the progressive era, when we broke the other way and now senators are elected directly by the people, nobody in the Senate represents states as such anymore. Well, what about all those Supreme Court decisions that were decided having that presupposition firmly in place? Now none of them really hold water anymore either. Do states matter at all anymore? I don't think they really do, save as administrative subdivisions of the federal government. Another thing that we didn't really presuppose was the massive federal bureaucracy that now just sits there. Think about an average day in your life. What do you do in an average day that no level of government has anything to say about? Somebody's thinking, I can breathe. And no, you can't. There's all kinds of legislation declaring what you can and cannot breathe. So the government involves itself in what you can breathe all the time. Notice I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that government is involved. Look, my day, I wake up. There's an alarm. It's a regulated piece of electrical equipment. I'm on a mattress, regulated. It says so on that sticker. I'm not allowed to tear off. I go in the bathroom. The bathroom is the most regulated room in your house, probably. Or throw water on my face. Well, water, regulated, very regulated, where I live in Tucson, Arizona. I walk into my kitchen, literally every appliance I see is regulated. But the wife is in there. She's regulated too. Who you can marry and under what conditions. Pretty clearly regulated. I couldn't marry her when she was 14. Yeah, I see the face you made right there. It's a little disgusting even to think about it, right? Well, okay. My children are there. They're regulated. How do I know? If I hit them, the force of government is coming down on me like a ton of bricks. And notice, I didn't say that I should be able to hit them. My dog, I can't be cruel to my dog. Very deeply regulated. If I want to go somewhere, I get in the car. The most regulated thing you ever own, unless you own an airplane. How did we get here? And notice we haven't even started talking about things like taxation. We're just talking about regular stuff in a regular day. The government is your partner in all things at every moment of every day. That wasn't the original design. We can disagree or agree on the level, how much of it we might want, but you're going to get all manner of unintended consequences when you're looking at something that's this pervasive in your life. So when we point at government and say, well, can you believe this? Antony and I always say, well, of course we can believe it. When you decide that it will be the final arbiter on all things in your life, you can kind of expect that all manner of things are going to come up really oddly in the wash.
But notice that there are two distinct questions here. One is the level of regulation itself, and reasonable people can agree and disagree on what sorts of things the government should be regulating.
Look, I hate government, and he kind of doesn't like government. But even we can kind of agree that a certain level of regulation is perfectly reasonable.
Sure.
I want clean water. Yep. Right? I love breathing clean air and things like this. And
and even a governmental minimalist would say, well, we need property rights.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, if you want property rights, you need a judiciary, you need a police force to enforce it, you probably need a legislature to define it, right? So you need some level of government. So there's this one question of, what level of regulation should we have? But then there's this other question I find much more interesting, which is how do you go about achieving it? You can achieve it at the federal level, or you could achieve it at the state and the local level. And it's that doing it at the state and local level, I argue, is much, much preferable because you bring to bear on the political system the same forces you have in the economic system that makes our economic system so vibrant. That is competition.
But let's not lose our minds here and present this as a panacea of some kind.
No.
It isn't.
It isn't because there are humans involved.
That's right. And anytime you've got human beings involved, it's going to be a gigantic pain.
Yes, you're going to have problems. The question is, where do you have more and less problems?
And look, I live in the United States, but then I live in Arizona, and then I live in Tucson, and then I can drill down one more level because I live in a neighborhood that has an HOA. And the HOA makes my life more miserable than Tucson or Arizona or the United States of America.
And notice what we can learn here. There's a huge warning amongst all of this to stay away from any idea of a global government, because a global government is all the problems we've been talking about on steroids. Imagine what would happen if people in India now the largest populated country in the world, could do the Owen thing and decide, okay, we want to spend lots of money and we can push the cost onto other countries via this global government. All of a sudden, you're going to have the problems that we now have federally in the United States on a planetary basis.
This became the problem in the European Union, right, where Germany came to subsidize everybody else.
Yeah. Why is Greece still a thing? Because it wasn't allowed to go bankrupt. Why was it not allowed to go bankrupt? Because it was part of the European Union, and it could spend as much as it wanted and foist the cost onto other European countries.
All predictable and understandable, but that was voluntary. Imagine if things aren't voluntary, how much worse they get. And you can say, and I think reasonably so, Harrigan, you're just a whiner, your HOA was voluntary. Well, yeah, but I couldn't buy a house in Tucson that wasn't in one. Now I could choose this one or that one. Any of them is going to make my life miserable. And they're making my life miserable right now because there's like 3 little spots on my house and they've decided I must paint it. Well, that sounds reasonable enough until you have the painters over and they want $12,000 to paint a house. So I have a mandatory $12,000 bill because some twerp, I think twerp is the correct word, because some twerp on what we call the art committee decided my house wasn't up to snuff. Can I not pay that? No. They'll slap a lien on my house. If I ever sell it, they'll siphon a bunch of money off on the sale. They can start eviction proceedings against me, all because I voluntarily joined an HOA. You start to sense the problem of collective action of any kind. And the question that reasonable people have is, how do you mitigate that? How, on the one hand, do you allow people to be free in a maximum sort of way, while nonetheless maintaining some sort of minimal standard that you want to have for social life?
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.